Hi, everyone, and welcome to this mini lecture on school structure. By structure, we mean how the education system is organized, funded, and staffed. Our focus is public K 12 school systems in the U.S. We'll briefly touch on these three areas: the history of education and how it ties in to issues with school structure today, the evolving role of government in schooling, and the hierarchy and staffing of school districts. History. We remember from our exploration of the history of education from colonial times to the 21st century that schooling in the colonies began with the philosophy that educated citizens were necessary to make the new society function. However, what schooling looked like across regions and who was able to attend varied and has evolved with mixed success over time. It is also important to point out that formal systems of schooling were not controlled at the federal level, but rather the regional and local levels. Do you remember this map from a previous lecture? It depicts the colonies, and we studied how the structure of education, how it was funded or supported, who were its teachers, what was taught, and what groups of students were able to attend varied widely by region. We did an exercise in which we looked at how these different structural aspects changed over time. For this lecture, let's keep these historical ideas in mind as we look at school structure today and see if we recognize any of these historical elements. One of the cultural influences on education has always been government's changing role. Let's look a bit more closely at the role of government by branch and level. Branches include, of course, legislative, executive, and judicial, and levels include federal, state, and local. At the federal level, we have political leaders, such as the Secretary of Education and the department, the U.S. Department of Education. The federal level is also where we see civil rights issues addressed, which would make sense because these are constitutional issues. We also see some work around national level assessments. At the state level is where more of the work of schooling is done. At the state level, we have districting, which can become a very contested issue. We also have state level elected and appointed leaders. States develop funding formulas, set standards, calendars, criteria for curricula, and govern professional licensure and certification for teachers. Finally, at the local or district level is where we have staffing, more funding, and direct input to curricula and instruction. Branches of government. This is beginning to sound like a high school civics class, isn't it? We all remember the three branches of government: executive, legislative, and judicial. In terms of school structure, the executive branch is mostly concerned with issues of compliance, appointing political leaders, and assessments. The legislative branch is where laws are made and funding is determined. Finally, the judicial branch is there to balance the powers and settle disputes, which often results in case law that has much impact on education. No discussion of government's role in education is complete without mentioning these key pieces of federal legislation. First, the National Defense Act of 1958, which allocated federal funding for education. Next, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of '65, which provided funding to support equal access to education and thereby established the federal government's role in civil rights and education. In 2002, that act was reauthorized as the No Child Left Behind Act, which is often looked upon as ushering in the era of standards-based education and the idea of closing the achievement gap. Reauthorized again in 2015 as the Every Student Succeeds Act, this act attended more to the needs of diverse student populations. According to our textbook authors, Kaplan and Owings, education is mostly controlled at the state level. That means we do not have one national education system like Germany or Japan, but 50 different systems. Furthermore, most states delegate responsibility to the local or district levels. This makes school districts the primary operating units of American public education. School districts are usually governed by local school boards comprised of elected members of the public. The public's interest is usually focused on funding and accountability. The school district is run by a superintendent or professional educator who is accountable to the school board for the district's performance. Districts usually have central offices with varying levels of staff that support the superintendent. Within the districts, there are many schools: elementary, middle, and high school, and perhaps specialty schools. Superintendents often delegate the operation of individual schools to principals and other administrators who have varying levels of autonomy over their individual buildings. Of course, schools are staffed by teachers and many other specialized staff, such as counselors, reading specialists, ESL teachers, special education teachers, and aides. Schools also have administrative staffs that ensure the smooth running of daily operations. You may have noticed the rather matter of fact and uncritical tone of this lecture, but don't worry, nothing is wrong. And I haven't forgotten that we can't simply digest facts without asking some tough questions. This is college, after all. We know that the institution of education in our country, something we idealize as a great equalizer, is not working that way for everyone. Yes, that's my opinion. However, we know that student achievement and education outcomes are correlated to many factors of school structure. So far in this course, we have exposed how education further emphasizes disparities in SES, race, and gender. If we come back to the history that we touched on at the beginning, we might remember that the political, ideological, and philosophical foundations of this U.S. institution were such that they met the needs of one particular group. Over time, and with varying degrees of success, more students were able to access public education. Yet, we might ask how the structure of the institution itself has evolved to accommodate this diversity. Has it? And when I say it, I mean the structure, the organization, funding, and staffing that we touched on here. How has it changed? Issues of school structure and student achievement worthy of further exploration, whether in your paper for this course or in future endeavors, include how class size, teacher quality, instruction, resources and funding, and curricula, just to name a few, impact student achievement. Several of you are exploring issues of safety and violence in school. I raise the issue of disciplinary policies and how the school to prison pipeline phenomena, although beyond the scope of this course, is disproportionately affecting student populations by race. If you take just one thing away from this course, take away the skills to see, hear, and speak critically about the institution of education. And that is all, folks.